Well, thank you, firstly, for bringing me to Slovakia. It's very exciting for me. And I hope you take some inspiration, but I'm certainly already very inspired to be here. To be at a place where there's active discussion in your society about the future of education is really, really exciting. I'm really, really pleased to be here, to work out how this works. Does this work? Yeah. So when Peter asked me to talk about the English system of education, I asked him for how many days would you like me to talk about it, because I think, honestly, it's a fairly big topic. And I've got about 45 minutes. So I'll try and give you some highlights, but let me tell you one which is really important to me. Is to tell you that there is a lot to learn from the English system, and there is, as much as there is to learn that is positive, there is also a lot to learn from our mistakes as well. And we continue to make mistakes. It is not a perfect system. It is, I think, one of the best systems for inclusion in the world. It's not the best. I don't think it's as good as America or Canada. But it's certainly a very good system indeed. And we have a lot to be proud of. I think I would emphasize to you, learn better from our mistakes than from what we've achieved. I think that's even more important. Just one interesting story to reflect on how I got into this. Somebody asked me recently, why did I go into education and education psychology? You know what, no one had ever asked me that before, so I never really had to think about it. I should have thought about it before I went into it, I'm sure. I remembered my best friend when I was at primary school. I'm talking about the age of 5 to 10. And he had cerebral palsy. How do you say that in Slovakia? He had disabilities, okay? And his parents had to fight the local authority, the local government, to get him into a mainstream school. Because at the time, 30, 40 years ago, the assumption was that anyone with any disability would go to a special school. It didn't help also the fact that he was from an Indian family, in an all-white school. And I felt at the time, you know, that there was something wrong here. The parents themselves had to pay for a wheelchair ramp to be put at the entrance of the school. Now, every school in England has a wheelchair ramp at the entrance, even if you don't have wheelchair users. Everyone has a ramp, it's obvious, right? Every museum, every art gallery, every institution in the country has a wheelchair ramp. In fact, if you don't, I don't think that you can pass the regulations to open. Anyway, we're just comparing the story. They wanted to send him to a special school. I think that they sent him to the PETA Institute in Hungary for a short while. Are you familiar with this? No? It's a world-leading institute. It's around the corner here. It's a world-leading institute for working with disabled children. And now, compared to today, all children are expected to go to a mainstream school. And you would have to fight the local government to get them into a special school. There still are special schools, but very, very few places. The assumption is that all children, regardless of their needs, will go to a mainstream school. That is a massive shift in the course of 30 years. And part of what I want to do today is to show you some of the journey that England has gone on to make this massive shift. I listened to a radio program, you know, you've all heard of the BBC, right? So they have a 50-year celebration of BBC Two. Have you heard of BBC Two? It's the second channel of BBC. And they have a celebration this year. And one of the things that they played was a a recording of a program from 1980, and it uses the language that, to describe children with disabilities, that if you were to use that today, you would for sure lose your job. There might be a legal case against you, you might end up in prison. They would describe words, and they didn't mean it negatively at the time. They just didn't have the consciousness, the awakeness, the awareness to be able to describe in a friendly way, or in a way that they didn't realise it was offensive. But such is the shift of thinking in our society. I don't think this works. It does. The other way. So I just wanted to make a few open remarks and say what I think inclusion is not. I don't think inclusion is one nice idea to happen in the classroom. I don't think inclusion is one amendment to the school policy. I think that inclusion is a shift in thinking. And a shift in thinking doesn't just happen like that. A shift in thinking happens through a process. And that's why I said I'm quite excited to be part of this. It's a process, right? It doesn't happen overnight. So I want to talk about this word here, school management. Inclusion is more an approach to school management and the classroom. It's a paradigm shift. I think for those of you who are head teachers or senior leaders in schools, or at least know how schools are run, know that when we talk about the idea of including lots of different types of children with lots of different types of needs, then that can seem like an administrative nightmare. It's complicated. How do you do it? So one of the things which I'm trying to say is that I don't think it's so much of a specific activity, although if you want to talk about specific activities, I'm happy to do that for a long time. But I want to say that it's mainly an approach and an attitude. If your starting point is, we do include everybody, then all of the constant following discussions are from that perspective. If the question is, should we include everybody, can we include everybody, then you're going to be in a very ambivalent place, a very doubtful place. It's hard enough to be able to work out the specifics without having to work out the philosophy along the way. So I say that your starting point is the philosophical approach. So this isn't just about the school, but about the whole system of education and welfare. I think my latest article in the newspapers in England was about the issue that the education system in England is being asked to make sure that impoverished students, poor students, make equal amount of progress to students from wealthy backgrounds. And one of my arguments was that, well, why is that an educational issue? What has that to do with education? And actually, we could say, you know what, inclusion is not an educational issue at all. It's a philosophical issue, it's a sociological issue, but I want to really say it's both. That education doesn't happen without welfare and social care, and social thinking doesn't happen without education. They're not two separate entities. It's a little bit like saying, we may assume in England that there is a difference between geography and history, but that's only because at some point in the 19th century, somebody said there was a thing called geography and such a thing called history. I don't know, it could be earlier than the 19th century. But is there really a difference? Isn't everything sort of geography and history? You know, I'm using this as a paradigm to be able to say, I think thinking about education and social context in these binary way doesn't make sense. It has to be together. I think this Top point over here says, it is not a moral imposition, but an educational concept. I'm interested when I talk about the philosophy of inclusion, to think of it more about the philosophy of education, rather than the philosophy of, well, philosophy, the idea, but rather it is an education, an approach in pedagogy. It isn't a specific tool, but rather it is an attitude and an approach in how you approach education. Last week, this is the Inclusion Expert Awards, last week in the Parliament building in London, myself and my colleagues who run a company called Inclusion Expert delivered 5 awards to the top schools in England who are the best schools in England for inclusion, in our view. And I just wanted to tell you a very little bit about those schools, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. There's one school that is a top school for gifted children. And the majority of their children go to Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, you've heard these names, yes? But they do not allow them to sit exams until they have given a total of 1,000 hours of community service throughout the life of the school. That includes trips to Africa, that includes working as tutors in their local community, etc., etc. I just thought that was amazing. And actually, one of the reasons, you may argue that surely that's a distraction of their education. I argue that is real education. It's not instead of learning. It is learning. It's learning in real ways about the world. And it's one of the reasons why so many are successful and go on to Oxford and Cambridge. When they sit in the interview in Oxford and Cambridge, they have something to say. Not, I just studied these subjects. It's, I studied these subjects and went to Africa, we went to Asia. We spent, I raised thousands of pounds for this project in my local community that I came up with. I helped these children, these are their names, this is what happened to them. I know these families, I would go in and I would go and help those families. That's powerful education. I could keep going on about this. Show one more award. Keep going on about the awards. One more award about a child who, there's one particular school who I went to visit and found that they have the largest cross-section of types of students I've ever seen. We're talking from complete physical impairment and cognitive impairment, all the way through to very, very gifted students. And what was interesting about this school is the expected levels of each of those individual students were not only met, but the students from impairment background or very poor background, or students who, 25 of 30 students in a classroom that didn't speak English as their first language, all of those students made even more progress than the average student. That's a truly inclusive and outstanding school. Head teachers who say to me, it's not possible, to which I say, just go and have a look at that school. It is possible. It's amazing. And it's not complicated, it's not hard. It's not that they find it hard. In fact, the opposite. The better the school in terms of inclusion, the happier the school feels. It's, when I walk into the school, I feel this overwhelming sense of community. It's a powerful experience, as do the students, which is possibly why they may perform well. I want to say that, let me just talk about this one. It is about the individual, for example, the bike. I came across a school in England that I thought was amazing because they understand the level of understanding of their child's needs is very deep. I'll give you an example. They had a student that was failing mathematics. What would you do as a teacher? Give them extra help in mathematics. That's what I would have done. They didn't do that. They bought the boy a bike, and his maths grades went up. Yes, makes sense? So what happens is they understood that this boy couldn't get to school on time in the morning because he was taking care of his younger sister who was disabled at home. And he kept missing the school bus. And then he ended up being 45 minutes late every day. And for some reason, and I don't know why, that maths was the first lesson of every single day. So they bought him a bike. He made it to school on time, and his maths grades go up. It's a difference in level of understanding and approach of understanding. It's not a specific case. I'm not suggesting that anyone here should go back to their school and buy a bike for their students. That's not the point. The point is, what's the level of understanding? Yes? The multi-agency approach, for example, the girl with. Ah, yes, I remember what that was. I didn't finish that sentence. The girl with. I give you another example of a multi-agency approach. When I talk about multi-agency approach, as opposed to it just being about education, I think it's talk about education and society and how that might work together. Well, one of the aspects of it working together can be how the different services, such as social services, child and adolescent mental health service, health in general, welfare. I hope all this translates okay into Slovak. Social care, yes, does that make sense to you? Social care of families and how supported families. So here's an interesting example of a girl who was not going to go on a trip with a school. Every school in England takes a trip to the countryside to do assessments and coursework for an exam. And this exam is worth 50% of the exam, and the school generally pay for it. But this girl was not going to go, and the reason why, because she had some psychological challenges, she would not leave her mother. So the school took from the impoverishment fund, the fund specifically for students with financial difficulties, and they paid for the mother to go. Now, I knew the inspector that went to look at the school and look at the finances, and the school was worried that they would get in trouble for this. But the inspector told me about it, we put it in the newspapers, we thought it was so brilliant. What they're doing is they're demonstrating their understanding of not just the child, but also they're seeking support from social services and from counsellors and from health practitioners to help them understand what has affected education. Yes? What really would work? If a school tries to answer the question, what would work for these students, then you can only know so much. How can you possibly know everything? You're a school teacher. You don't have the background in counselling necessarily all the time to do it. But if you work with the agencies that do, then they can support and act. I think we should move on, because this was the 1 minute introduction. Shall we move on now? Here's what we're going to talk about today. Sorry, it was almost finished. I want to mention a little bit about the process of change and some ideas. Number 2, what has worked? And number 3, what hasn't worked? And then something about specifically what I'm doing as well. Let's see how quickly we can do this. Process of change. There's a really useful slide which I have a little bit later. Can I just show you which one? This process of change is the most accurate I've ever seen. This is like England. This is exactly it. It's a complete mess. There is no such thing as an obvious, clear process of change. Anyone who thinks it's like this is living in a library. Honestly, it doesn't happen in the real world. And part of the reason why is because in England you've had, for example, the National Autistic Society, you've had the British Dyslexia Society, you've had local government, Society of Head Teachers, Association of Head Teachers, lots of different organisations all battling their needs, right? And that's okay, that's called society. But the discussion means that, you know, whoever has a really powerful voice, you know, maybe this discussion here is as effective as it can be in the media, and that's not necessarily the best measure of obvious change. I don't know if that's really true or not. But here, I would say that in England we have had lots of different influences on the system. Usually it begins like this. The British Dyslexia Association would campaign in the 1970s, and by the time you're in the 1980s, we pass a law. By the time you hit the 1990s, that law is now in place, and every school is now doing it, and now it's time to update it. That process is basically how things have worked, with lots of arguments along the way. This September, we have a rewriting of the Children and Families Law, and myself and various colleagues have been advising the government. And you know, I say to the government, we need to do this, this and this, and they say, okay, great, and of course they don't do this, this and this. So, you know, I don't know how this thing works exactly, but I'm sure that's true of most governments around the world, right? That's basically how things work. It's however you campaign, what's going to sound politically right, how much media space you get. Oh, this has been really important. There was a book in England that was very, very big, and it's become a very big play as well, called A Curious Incident of a Dog in the Night Time. Have you heard of this? No? Has anyone heard of it? Good. Right, okay, I'm not mad, right? You have heard of it. It's an amazing book about an autistic boy, but suddenly, you know, you have many children across the country and many adults and teachers reading about an autistic boy. They didn't pick up a book called Autism, Everything You Need to Know. They read a novel which was about an autistic child. And it was amazing. And it became a top play in London. It still is. Come to London and see the play. It's amazing. That is a much better way of changing minds than coming out with a textbook or speaking at a lecture like this. Believe me, if I could write a novel, I would, but I can't really. That's been a very important change. Also, famous people in England declaring, you know, I'm dyslexic. Some very famous people who are autistic spectrum or dyslexic, and they're proud of it. You know, this changes things a lot. Inclusion in England means lots of different things, and I won't. And this is why we don't have time to go into every single detail. But let's just have a look at the broad spectrum. Looked after children. Is the translator okay to just read it through? I'll say. Looked after children. A looked after children is, a looked after child is a child who is in foster care or who has been adopted. In England today, a child who has been in foster care is more likely to go to prison than to go to university. Which is one of the reasons why I say to you, don't do what England has done, because we haven't worked everything out. This is one of the hardest areas. I know it's not just in England, it's all over the world. Children in foster care is a very, very difficult situation. I'm sure it's true here. Is it true here? Special educational needs usually refers to learning needs or physical needs. Social, emotional, behavioural difficulties. LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender. You know, there are certain countries I can't say that still. English as an additional language. All of you here would fall into that category, probably. But I know that in Slovakia you have children from many different types of backgrounds that have Slovak as a different language. And I'm sure you'd agree with me, they are one of the hardest types of children to teach. In England, by the way, we have quite a large Roma community as well, and they really, really struggle. and they fall under the EAL. And EMA, ethnic minority attainment. What's interesting about being in London is that it is one of the most ethnically diverse places in the world. So it's not really a choice, we have to be inclusive, really. Gifted and talented and free school meals. There's 4 key points I wanted to mention about this. The question is, how do you narrow the gap between the attainment of this? Basically, 1/3 of all students in England fall under one of these categories. And generally, if you are in one of these categories, you do not attain what you might expect it to be attained. I'm not saying that if I'm a top student, Peter would be a top student. So Peter's a top student, he would expect it to get top grades, yes? I'm an average student, I'm expected to get average grades. The problem is this, Peter's going to get top grades, but I only got poor grades. Why? That's the problem here. Not that we expect them to all get top grades, they're not going to, but at least to get what they are due, what they're worth, what they can get. That's how you make a fair and equal society, and that's the problem. In England, we refer to this idea as narrowing the gap. In England and also in America, we've identified that narrowing the gap starts for poor students of the same intelligence as their wealthy student counterparts. It starts at the age of 2. Yes? And of course, how much does it have to do with the school? Not that much really. It has mainly to do with home. And it has to do with the socialisation and how much is going on at home. The question is, what can society do to support the home? That's a question from an inclusive perspective, yes? What's interesting to me is, just as a cost-benefit issue, you might say to me that special educational needs will cost England a lot of money. I know it costs about £6 billion. But if you don't spend the £6 billion there, when they are older and they have less capacity to take care of themselves, it will end up costing the government £20 billion. So you're better off spending it as an investment almost in fostering independence. Also, the lack of potential is something that's very difficult to measure financially. Theoretically, if half of these students do not attain their potential, then you're losing on economic gain. For example, you know there was a European election, wasn't there? In England, they had this big misunderstanding that, not just in England, it's also in France and in everywhere in Europe, that immigration is an economic problem. In the history of immigration, it's always proven that immigrants bring more to the country, mainly because they work slightly harder, they work slightly harder at school. In England, 1/7 of all businesses were set up by immigrants. It's amazing. I mean, I don't mean to get political here, I don't disagree with, I don't know your situation in Slovakia, and I don't profess to know it. But if you think about the potential that all of these students have to benefit society, it's missing if you don't invest at a younger age. Is that clear? That's all I want. I want to give you 4 perspectives from not from me, but from people who I meet, of what success might look like. And just before we do, I want to tell you that this picture here helps me articulate what I think that we have done amazingly well. We have an incredible social care service, a health service, teachers, local government, parents, school system. It's amazing, it's world class. What I think that you may be able to get from this picture is that it's not quite, can I just skip forward a little bit? That, yes? It's not quite there. But the fact that we have these things is in itself amazing. And there is a sort of proximity. There is a discussion that goes on here. There's a lot that gets lost in the middle, but at least there is a continued discussion here. There is a continued discussion here. It could be better, but there is. Parents have access to local government. There are mechanisms for that in a very positive way. Schools and parents speak all of the time. It could be better, but this is what I want to show as a major success. I'm going to summarise some of the key successes. From a child's perspective, if you were to ask a child in England, they would tell you that they feel that their needs are actually being recognised and actually being met, which is an amazing thing to say. The vast majority of children in England will tell you that. And the reason why is because we have publicity around recognition. Yes, autism is no longer a word where people go, what's that? If we say Tourette's syndrome, in England, Tourette's syndrome is being made famous because a couple of famous people in England have Tourette's. And so everybody in England knows what Tourette's is, you know? And the Tourette's Foundation campaigns to be known as well. And so every school knows what Tourette's is. And now, when I was at school, there was a boy who had Tourette's, he made noises like this, like this. And everybody made fun of this boy because he was just annoying. Now, every child who has Tourette's in the country can proudly say, you know what, I have Tourette's. When I was at school, even this boy himself didn't know what it was. His parents didn't know what it was. Now they all do. Everyone's an expert on Tourette's now. Yes? But a really important thing is we have clear assessments and we have clear law that holds it together. Clear assessments. It's not a, I think he has Tourette's. There is clear assessments, there are clear procedures. It is no longer just the doctor in the local community who can refer for assessments, but it is also the school that refers for local assessments. It is the school that contains and receives all of the paperwork from the hospitals, from the specialists, etc. It's the school that is the heart of understanding the child. The parent is supported financially, legally, structurally, socially, and with care. Most parents will tell you that my child's needs can be met, and I have support services for myself as well. And this happens, importantly, at the youngest of ages. So, for example, I mentioned the gap begins at the age of 2 and 3, so support services begin pre-birth. It's a very, very broad section of support that parents receive. Teachers would tell you that they have changed their entire approach to learning, to teaching, from being the teacher at the front of the classroom, like I'm doing now, which is incorrect, to lots of different needs within the classroom, and I'm facilitating lots of individual learning. Not I'm teaching one lesson to all of you, and some will understand it better, and some will understand it less, but rather facilitated the understanding of every child from their own perspective. There's a very powerful idea, there's a shift in thinking around what teaching actually is. Are you teaching to explain to the world just how much you know, like me? Or are you teaching to facilitate real understanding? If you were to come with me into a school and you see a teacher who's standing like me, teaching at the front, then, and we were inspecting them, then I would say to you, this is a fail. This classroom is a fail. Because I don't want to see a teacher at the front, I want to see a teacher going around every table, speaking to children. I want the children to be active in learning. I want to hear not silence, but discussions everywhere in the classroom. School, this is a common phrase that I hear in schools which are really inclusive. We feel like a whole community. There's a sense of pride about being part of something which is bigger than just an educational establishment. just to explain the picture, this is the Queen when she was younger, and her soldiers, and then because they wear a big hat, one of them fainted. I remember this, it was 20 years ago. I want to share with you things which haven't worked. So please, this is the most important bit. Please sit up and listen for this. Everything else you can fall asleep for. Just sit up and listen for this bit. One is, instead of making at the centre of this discussion, we had school. What I want to do is to make the centre of the discussion the child. It's your starting point. And your second point is, from starting point with the child, is not what services do we have, but rather what services can we integrate. It doesn't matter if there's less. I think in England we have more and more, but in a way the services go off in that direction, and those services in that direction, and those services in that direction, and the child is left out. An example, a very specific example would be a child who has serious problems at home, and the communication about what's really going on at home is not clear. So there wasn't a meeting with the school by social services to fully explain what's going on, and for the school to be explained how they can best support the child, yes, in the classroom. So in this environment, the school doesn't know. Social services, is it their fault? Is it school's fault? Whose fault is it? Well, forget blame for a second. What we don't have is a system that is automatically integrated. The passing of the new law in September says that all children should be allowed an education, health and care plan, which means, for the first time in British history, that there is, I should say English history, it's not true in Scotland or Northern Ireland, it's different, English history. There is, for the very first time, there must be, by law, a joined up document around education, health and social care. Before now, it's only a good idea. Now it's actually a law. Yes? How long will it take for schools to actually achieve this properly? I don't know, your guess is as good as mine. 5 years, 10 years? This is the biggest problem that teachers have. How many of you are teachers or have been teachers? You, yes? Well, you will know as well as I do that being a teacher is the hardest job in the world, yes? And partly because you have no time for anything. So how about no time for these things? Further training, for dealing with parents, to deal with whole school matters, to do differentiation, to deal with policy and legal issues. There's no time for this. This is a major problem. Yes, I say to you, let's get all of the teachers in the country to differentiate. You know what I mean by differentiation? How do you say differentiation in Slovak? How do you do this?
Rozdielnosť.
Rozdielnosť. Yeah? Let's get everyone to do this rozdielnosť thing. Yes? But when? When are they going to do it? How much extra are you going to pay them? What, no extra and no extra time? So you're just going to get everyone to do it? How are you going to do that? That's a problem. That's still a major, major problem. Not just in England or in Slovakia, all over the world. I have my own answers to this, but I don't have enough time to... Unless you just want to stay the night, we could just talk all the way through the night. I want to show you the same 4 views of success. I want to show you 4 views of failure as well. A child might tell you, my name is Jonathan. That's an English name, right? My name is Jonathan, and I have Tourette's. And I think to myself, do you mean your name is Jonathan? Surely your name is Jonathan, right? No, my name is Jonathan and I have Tourette's. Well, my name is Jonathan and I have autism. What we've created is a label culture. the advantage of making everybody in the country know about dyslexia, autism, and lots of different types of disabilities is that we can be a very understanding and recognising society. The disadvantage is that we have a society that now labels. Oh yes, yes, he's a lovely student, Jonathan. He just has autism. You know, we, in a way, are taking away from him being a person. Does that explain clearly? Did I explain that clearly? That idea of labelling. Yes? Most parents would tell you, yes, England has an amazing amount of information and has an amazing amount of services, but it's very, very difficult to access. And you literally have to be like a lawyer if you want to work the system. It's complicated. And most parents that I've met have ended up crying and feeling upset and feeling like the system is too much, it's too difficult. So I don't think that the education system is there yet in terms of helping the parents. All of the information's there, it's just difficult to access it. Teachers would tell you not only the lack of time, which I already mentioned, but also there's a lack of training that's any good. Well, I don't know about your training here in Slovakia, but most training in England happens straight after school for an hour. You know, it's the worst time of the day. We call it the graveyard shift in England, because most teachers are like, you know, exhausted already. You know, and after 1 hour of teaching, you know, if you come back in 6 months' time, I mean, how much do you think the average teacher will remember from a 1 hour lesson about something that's really important? I mean, they're not going to remember it. Training is really difficult. And finally, schools will tell you that they are judged very, very harshly. And the number one thing that the judgment in England, the judge of the Ofsted, the Office of Standards for Education, when they come and visit a school and make an assessment, what they are looking for, number one, is how inclusive the school is. Now, that makes most head teachers and most senior leaders in the school quite scared, and inclusion has become a word of fear rather than a word of, we're doing this, isn't this great? I want to tell you about a special role that was introduced into England in the 1990s, and then it became a law in the year 2001. And the law has literally just changed. The law changed properly in September. This is one of the best things that England did, and also one of the worst things. It made a role in England a legal requirement, so that there are only 3 jobs in England which are legally required in a school. One is the head teacher, that's a legal requirement. Number 2 is the chair of governance. Do you have an equivalent in here as well? Governance. Yes, chair of governance is another legal role. And the 3rd legal role in England was introduced called the SENCO, Special Educational Needs Coordinator. Their job was to coordinate all of the special needs, to do all of the assessments, to understand all of the students, to take care of all of the students, to meet with all of the parents, basically to meet with all of the agencies, basically to do everything, right? The problem then became that it was only this one person in the school who was doing all of those things. So 10 years after this job, had schools themselves changed? No. Because all of the teachers were still doing what they were doing. Now, the new law says that the SENCO is not allowed to do all of these things, that it has to be all teachers who are doing differentiation, who are meeting with parents, who are understanding their students. Yes? That's the major shift that's happened now, but it took a good 20 years to work that out. So one of the best things you could do is get a SENCO. It's also one of the worst things you could do. What is effective training? I think this is a very, very big topic. But I don't think I really have time to cover it. But I want to perhaps just mention 1 minute about what I'm doing. My company set up an award for excellence for schools, for managing inclusion. And it's, if you were to study online my program, which we wrote for the program of inclusion, you basically study it online, and it's not a study like you would do at university, like an academic study, although there's a lot of writing there and a lot of articles and things. It's all about practice. And myself and my colleagues think of ourselves as practitioners, mainly because we want to help people in their practice. Anyway, so what we've done is, with the University of East London, we've arranged that all of the practices that you put in place should be recognised with a postgraduate degree. You don't have to do the postgraduate degree bit, but it's a nice idea. And also an award for your school. And the reason is for two things. One is because we wanted to say to people that inclusion is something to be proud of. I want schools to put on their website, in England every school has a website, I'm sure it's true here. I want people to put on their website an award that they are proud to be an inclusive school. At the moment there really isn't. And the other thing is, I want this sort of degree is to be done by future head teachers. And I want the next generation of head teachers to be, to have trained in leadership through inclusion practice. At the moment, the vast majorities of head teachers themselves don't know that much about inclusion. It's amazing. They get a Senko to do it. So I want the next generation of head teachers to, and this is a way of promoting people through their own careers by giving them a master's level certification of leadership through inclusion. Well, that was it, really. I mean, I could talk for the next few days, because I'm quite passionate about this, but I think taking some questions is what we should do. Is that about right, Peter?